Okay, this week's title is Mr. Big Mouth. Now, I'm not going to say who it's about or anything like that. Um, it should say by John Howard. Very funny. We talk about the convergence of events, and all these things are going to be happening in the near term. We know all these things, these little pictures that I represent them by on this slide, they're all converging, and they're happening more and more. They're at least the ability of them to be completely fulfilled is becoming closer and closer, and it certainly seems to indicate that we live at a time. And as I said, a couple weeks, even major magazines of the world are noting that something's going on. The world's in meltdown. The world is disrupted. There is violence everywhere. The culture seems to be coming apart. I saw this statistic this morning. I was stunned by this, okay? These are the top-selling books, fiction books, adult fiction since 2004, okay, so over the last 10 years. And one that's troubling, of course, well, here at the bottom you have The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown. He writes about these kind of crazy conspiracies. Jesus was married, and the Da Vinci Code and that type of thing. So stuff he comes out are pretty popular. To Kill a Mockingbird, that's kind of interesting that it's still a bestseller after all these years. And I hear a sequel's coming out on that too, by the way. But Dan Brown again. And then up here a little bit further, The Shack by William Paul Young, which is just a horrible book from a theological perspective. It misportrays who God really is. It portrays a non-judgmental God, which is why a lot of people like the God of The Shack. Because we all want a God who's not going to judge us for our sin. Yes, sir. Yeah. But it's done in such a way to teach truth about God. That's the point. It's a fiction book. We all know that it's a story, but the story is done to convey certain things about God that this guy claims are true about God. And it's all false. It is false, but it's been a huge bestseller. And then look here, the E.L. James books of 50 Shades of Grey, 50 Shades Darker, 50 Shades Freed. There's a new movie coming out called 50 Shades of Grey. These are pornographic, soft pornographic books. Those totals are not exactly reflective of what was sold, because when it came out, it was originally just an electronic edition. And that author has sold over 50 million copies of books. I mean, if an author sells 500,000, that's like cause for celebration. But she sold over 50 million copies of this book, and it is pornographic. It's coming out, and I think the fact that books like that are so popular in our culture speaks volumes about where our culture is. And since, well, it's not a good thing. There are a number of passages that talk about a world leader that's coming. I'm going to read through a few of those just so you can have sort of an idea as to what people will need to be looking for. All these are from Daniel. I could read many other passages, but these give kind of a good flavor of this coming world leader that we call the Antichrist. Verse 19 of Daniel chapter 7. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boast, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. Verse 21, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the ancients of day came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High. This is a man of superior ego. He is a narcissist unlike any in human history. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom, the Messiah's kingdom, will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. And we should be alarmed by what these things say because they're horrific. Then in Daniel chapter 8, in another vignette that he has about the end times, talking about this horn, this last leader, it even made itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. In Daniel 11, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god. In Thessalonians it says, above everything that is called God, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all, but instead he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Now, this is a description of a coming world leader. And I am not today, in the things that I'm presenting to you, asking you to come to a conclusion that we have identified this world leader. But there are people on the world scene that I believe, if we look at what the description is, the deception that will come from this man, the narcissism and that type of thing, there are certainly people who are, at least we can confidently say, precursors to this man. And they give us a picture of how this man will be. Now, and you know who I'm talking about. And you will know, and I'm not going to say it right now, but we live in a world that right now is under assault from radical Islam. This is a picture of the way things have changed over the past year and the different areas in which radical Islam is now predominant, exercising authority and power. Of course, we have the situation in Syria and Iraq. We have the Houthis that have taken over in Yemen now in a coup. We have Al-Shabaab down here in Somalia. Boko Haram in Nigeria, which is growing, has killed thousands of people, burned them to death in many instances, chopped them apart in others. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb there in West Africa. And then we also have another group that's growing now related to ISIS that's in Libya, what used to be Libya. Here's General Jack Keane, former 4-star general, talking just a little bit about a week ago about this particular chart.
Is it possible to look at that map in front of you and claim that the United States policy and strategy is working, or that Al-Qaeda is on the run? It is unmistakable that our policies have failed, and the unequivocal explanation is U.S. policy has focused on disengaging from the Middle East, while our stated policy is pivoting to the East. U.S. policymakers choose to ignore the very harsh realities of the rise of radical Islam. In my view, we became paralyzed by the fear of adverse consequences in the Middle East after fighting two wars. Moreover, as we sit here this morning, in the face of radical Islam, U.S. policymakers refuse to accurately name the movement as radical Islam. We further choose not to define it, nor explain its ideology. And most critical, we have no comprehensive strategy to stop it or defeat it. We are reduced to a very piecemeal effort using drones in Yemen and Pakistan, a vital tactic but not a strategy, and air power in Iraq and Syria, while insisting an unproven indigenous ground force. Our partnering program with other nations is fragmented with no overall strategy. This approach almost certainly guarantees we will be incrementally engaged against one radical group after another with no end in sight.
And in light of that, though, what has been the thing that has been most troubling to our administration? The fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of what the administration will claim is our biggest ally in the Middle East, was asked directly by Congress when he was going to be in Washington to speak at the AIPAC convention, to come over and speak to Congress. And the administration has been in meltdown, and even a guy who portrays himself as a great wise man, Thomas Friedman, he's really foolish most of the time in what he writes, but he talks about this is a bad mistake that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to come and speak to Congress. It's horrible what he's going to do. Here's a discussion on Fox about that very topic.
This is from Martin Indyk, who's a former ambassador to Israel from the United States, and he's been a guest here a lot. Look at what he said. We can put it on the screen. Netanyahu is using the Republican Congress for a photo op for his election campaign, and the Republicans are using Bibi, or Benjamin Netanyahu, for their campaign against Obama. He goes on to say, unfortunately, the United States relationship will take the hit. It would be far wiser for us to stay out of their politics and for them to stay out of ours. Martin Indyk, how about that, huh?
I think he's 100% right.
Now, Martin Indyk is a radical leftist that has been involved in the last several Democratic administrations, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and that type of thing, and he does not like Israel. If he claims he likes Israel, if he publicly states that, he's lying. Here's a comment by the White House Chief of Staff about this invitation.
The President's view is this relationship is in the national interest. It should be treated as nonpartisan. That's the way it's always been treated, and that's exactly how we'll do it.
And then here's a discussion with a number of different political consultants about what this all might mean.
I think, Harris, that is extraordinary and extraordinarily wrong-headed by the President. Let's put this in context. The President did not go to France, widely criticized by my colleagues and me for that, a bad decision. He is now going, as he should, to Saudi Arabia for King Abdullah's funeral, and he won't meet with our only stable democratic ally in the Middle East, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. Harris, there's a real problem here. When the Congress of the United States invites the Prime Minister, he's being invited by the American people. It's not a partisan act. And Harris, the world is in complete chaos, and our president is not showing leadership.
First of all, 67 years Israel has existed. I would say this is the lowest point of American presidential relations with the government of Israel. The Obama administration, the bottom, the worst ever, number one. Number two, Pat mentions Iran. That is the underlying issue in all of this. Number one, tick-tock, tick-tock. The clock is ticking. They're enriching. They're stalling, and we're letting them stall. Netanyahu's furious about it and worried to death. And Boehner is smart, actually, to say, let's do this. We're being cut out of this thing. Let's get him over here and raise the profile of these talks.
Former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Liz Cheney I don't know if you heard what she said last week, but basically what she said was, look, we're looking at now at least 4 capitals across the Middle East in countries where Iran-backed rebels have taken that capital city.
Yeah. Look,
right?
Yemen, as Pat was suggesting, is now in play, and Al-Qaeda is running rampant in both Sana'a, the capital, and throughout the country as a pro-U.S. government has fallen. Saudi Arabia is now at risk given the king's death. It appears that we're going to have a peaceful transition, but anything goes. Iraq is in worse shape than our administration is letting on. Syria is just a launching pad for ISIS. Obviously, the Iranian problem gets worse and worse as we move towards a deal that could put ourselves at grave risk. Harris, Liz Cheney was, if anything, underestimating the risk we face as a nation.
Well, if you take those ideas and look what he said about foreign policy and didn't say, you should be terrified. You can only do so much damage domestically, but he could destroy the United States' national security.
By the way, we have talked on here, building on that, that there is a vacuum in the world of leadership because this president has basically abdicated the role of the strongest leader in the world. He doesn't like it. He's not doing it. Same thing in Washington because he's bugged out of the system and said, oh, I'm going to rule by my pen and the telephone and memo. The congressional leadership has said, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going to run foreign policy our way from Capitol Hill. And it shouldn't be happening.
But look
None
what
of this should
Menendez
happen.
said. Well, look what Menendez...
Hold on 1 second. We have it.
We
And I
gotta
love
see
the
it.
fact that you brought that up.
Oh, yeah.
Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Cue it up.
I have to be honest with you. The more I hear from the administration and its quotes, the more it sounds like talking points that come straight out of Tehran. And it feeds to the Iranian narrative of victimization.
Pat.
This man 3 weeks ago was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, the ranking Democrat. If a Republican had said this, could you imagine the reaction? I watched the morning shows. I don't think anyone, most of those shows, was never mentioned what he said. There are Democrats, but somebody has got to go to this president, don't you think, Doug?
Who's he going to listen to, Doug?
him? Well, and get clued in?
So far, it looks to me like he's listening more to the Cubans than anybody else. I was just overseas in Davos, and so I spent some time with some Ukrainians and some Europeans. They see the president as MIA. They don't even mention the United States when they're talking about world problems, like what happened today in Greece. We now have a socialist government that's talking about abrogating their debt to the Europeans. We have Ukraine, which is now further at risk from separatists backed by Moscow. So it's a crisis.
And the man in the middle of that panel, Pat Caddell, is a Democrat consultant that consulted with Bill Clinton and other Democratic candidates for president over the last couple of decades. Here's yet another little clip.
Mr. Boehner was on 60 Minutes over the weekend after Israeli media reported Friday that this administration is furious it was not consulted on the invitation. The story in the Haaretz newspaper quoted one senior White House official as saying Mr. Netanyahu, quote, spat in our face publicly, and that's no way to behave, adding that, quote, there will be a price. At the same time, the Washington Post quotes a source close to John Kerry saying the secretary is also angry at Mr. Netanyahu, arguing that Secretary Kerry had gone to bat for Israel at the UN recently, and saying, quote, playing politics with that relationship could blunt Secretary Kerry's enthusiasm for being Israel's primary defender. Earlier, I spoke with State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki. Jen, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Megan. Great to be here.
That quote from the Washington Post, did they get it right? Is that how Secretary Kerry feels?
Well, Secretary Kerry spoke to this a bit last week. There's no question that he goes over and above the call of duty as it relates to our relationship with Israel. He's made dozens of calls, if not more, on their behalf in the past couple of weeks. And certainly, I think he felt, as we all did, the way this process went down bordered on the bizarre.
I had Charles Krauthammer on the program on Friday, and he called that response petulant, speaking about how for Israel, Iran really, truly poses an existential threat. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to want to make the case to anybody he can in America, but in particular to the people's representatives. Can you understand that point of view?
Well, yeah, you're right, Megan. And the fact is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has come and spoken to Congress many, many times. We welcome that. But the process was a little odd.
Yeah, it was. So headlines all over. The left in Israel's accusing Netanyahu of destroying ties with Washington. And this is all done in the context of the entire Middle East melting down politically with terrorism, terrorists being in charge of a number of capitals of countries and large chunks of the Middle East and everything being destabilized. You know, that Yemen thing, you should not discount that. Yemen sits at the head of the Red Sea and could shut down sea traffic that goes up the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal to Europe. It would have a devastating economic impact. And that is an Iranian-backed thing. So that's an Iranian proxy that's in charge there. Netanyahu said, look, I'm going to defend this. And so Obama said, look, I don't want Congress interfering in the Israeli elections. It's not proper for the United States to interfere in the Israeli elections. And Netanyahu's going to be here for a great photo op 2 weeks before those elections take place. And then this story, not reported significantly, but absolutely true. Obama's field campaign manager and another team paid for by U.S. tax dollars through one of their little funding charades that they do, is in Israel supporting the leftist candidates to take down Benjamin Netanyahu. That, my folks, is the very definition of hypocrisy. You will never find a better example of it in your life for that man to say, we shouldn't interfere, but he sends his team over, which he did in 2010, by the way, the last time they had elections. So the question is, who's going to be there? Biden says he's not going to go. Pelosi says she's probably going to go, but she hopes it doesn't happen. And again, we have all these things. You have the government in Europe going along. And I think this is an interview about what's going on with Yemen with Jen Psaki.
All right, let's move on to another topic. I want to ask you about Yemen, which, you know, basically is a hot mess now. And we played a soundbite of you on Friday, and I confess that Charles Krauthammer, who I mentioned earlier, he laughed at what you said. And here's why. The folks who are now in control of Yemen used to be a U.S.-backed government. We liked them. We were at least satisfied with them. But these are the guys in control now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Victory to Islam. So the American people may not be feeling too great about the new people in charge of Yemen. You were asked about these folks, the Houthis, last week, and here's what you said.
They do chant death to America and that kind of thing. So it's not as if they haven't expressed anti-American sentiment in the past.
Well, obviously, Matt, as I mentioned, we continue to assess our security needs every day, regardless of what's been said. But it is important to note that just this week, they stated that was not their intention.
So I mean, you know the follow-up, but you're taking them at their word that they no longer mean the chants?
Megan, first of all, I know you could never play all the back and forth we have on Yemen in the briefing, but we've been discussing this probably hours last week in the briefing.
I don't want to get deep into Yemeni politics. I just want to ask you whether you are actually saying that we should just trust this group because they now say, never mind all that chanting about death to America.
Well, I think our actions make clear that we don't just trust. I think it was important to note that that was something that was stated publicly. Now, there's no question.
So was the death to America
There's been a great deal of unacceptable violence. There's been a great deal of unacceptable violence, rhetoric, everything you've said. There's no question about that. But we're in a situation that is very tense. It's fluid. We have to see what's going to happen on the ground in Yemen. We don't know yet what's going to happen there.
Let's hope that was just bluster.
Does anybody know what the symptoms are of somebody who's had a lobotomy? It just kind of popped into my head. Here's a discussion about how to describe the Taliban with the guy that they trotted out to the press platform because I think the other guy's undergoing therapy or something.
How is what the Jordanians are talking about doing any different than what the United States did to get the release of Bergdahl, releasing prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay to the Taliban, which is clearly a terrorist organization?
Prisoner swaps are a traditional end of conflict interaction that happens as the war in Afghanistan wound down. We felt like it was the appropriate thing to do. The president's bedrock commitment as commander-in-chief is to leave no man or woman behind. That's the principle he was operating under.
Isn't that what the Jordanians are operating under?
Well, I think, John, the
Taliban is still conducting terrorist attacks, so you can't really say that the war has ended as far as they're concerned.
Well, I'd also point out that the Taliban is an armed insurgency. ISIL is a terrorist group, so we don't make concessions to terrorist groups. We feel
the Taliban is a terrorist group.
I don't think that the Taliban is an armed insurgency. This was the winding down of the war in Afghanistan, and that's why this arrangement was dealt.
They didn't tell me they were going to ask questions. I'm doing the best I can. I don't even believe it. And then, when he said armed insurgency, he kind of stopped because it was like, I think he was listening to hear if people fell over or heads exploded in the room or something. I don't know. They asked Charles Krauthammer, who is by training a psychiatrist, what he thought about it. This is what he had to say.
The Taliban is an armed insurgency, not a terrorist group. Back with the panel, Charles.
It slits throats, it attacks buses, it drives car bombs into markets, and it's not a terrorist group. Look, you can't parody this administration. The idea that the United States would not do this is preposterous. Of course we do. And also the idea that the war is winding down. Tell that to anybody who lives in Afghanistan. This is a fantasy. Obama's pretended that the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq are all winding down and the wars are all back. So, this is sort of embarrassing.
Okay, and then here's Obama talking a little bit about, how does what's his view of the Islamic world? Now remember, I did read some verses to give you an idea of a guy that the prophets described it would just say crazy things. And I'm not saying, I'm not making the connection. I'm just saying, it helps to understand maybe what might happen in the future.
Lindsey Graham says that he's bothered by the fact that you won't admit that we're in a religious war. There are others who say that...
Let me back that up.
Lindsey Graham says that he's bothered by the fact that you won't admit that we're in a religious war. There are others who say that the White House takes pains to avoid using the term Islamic terrorist. So my question to you is, are we in a war with radical Islam?
I think that the way to understand this is there is an element growing out of Muslim communities in certain parts of the world that have perverted the religion, have embraced a nihilistic, violent, almost medieval interpretation of Islam. And they're doing damage in a lot of countries around the world. But it is absolutely true that I reject a notion that somehow that creates a religious war, because the overwhelming majority of Muslims reject that interpretation of Islam. They don't even recognize it as being Islam. And I think that for us to be successful in fighting this scourge, it's very important for us to align ourselves with the 99.9% of Muslims who are looking for the same thing we're looking for: order, peace, prosperity. And so, I don't quibble with labels. I think we all recognize that this is a particular problem that has roots in Muslim communities, and that the Middle East and South Asia are sort of ground zero for us needing to win back hearts and minds, particularly when it comes to young people. But I think we do ourselves a disservice in this fight if we are not taking into account the fact that the overwhelming majority of Muslims reject this ideology.
And so here's a little video. Here's a little video clip of the 0.1% that actually has violent extremism coming out of Islam. This is on the streets of Raqqa. While you're watching that, by the way, this lady was stopped, this lady right here, because she was wearing a red vest. And so all the men gathered around her, and she was put on trial right there in the street. Now, I don't have the rest of the clip where they tried her, they pronounced her guilty before Allah, and they shot her in the head and killed her. That's in the video. This is a BBC clip of a young Yazidi lady from Iraq. She's not pleading to be rescued. She's pleading that they kill her and put her out of her misery of being a sex slave to these Islamic terrorists that are in ISIS, the Islamic State. It is not 0.1%. It is hundreds of millions of people that follow that religion that believe this. And for that man to sit there and say it's not a problem and it doesn't come out of religion, the man is evil that says such an outlandish thing. It is pure, unadulterated evil. Have I made myself clear? Well, there is some question as to his leanings. That's certainly the case. I know, it's clear. And then this thing with the Jordanian pilot who was put in a cage. They set the fire, and he burned to death, and then they came in and knocked the cage over with a bulldozer. The Jordanian leader, King Abdullah, was in Washington when that happened. He went back and said that Jordan is going to unleash revenge for this killing. And he's a Muslim. He is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, 34th generation descendant from Muhammad. His family, for many years, until the Saud family took over the area of Mecca and Medina, it was King Abdullah's family that was in charge of the Hashemites. They were in charge of the holy places in Mecca and Medina for centuries. So this has been sort of a recent change in the last 85 years or less. And of course, the New York Times reaction to all of this was to write an editorial after seeing this woman killed, the pilot burned to death alive in front of everybody in a pretty slick video production. They do an editorial about Abu Ghraib, something that happened over a decade ago. Folks, let me just say this. You need to understand the point at which we live in history. We live at a point in history in which, and we will see this increase until the Lord returns, and you might as well get used to it. We live with a large group of people that are in positions of power and influence that are completely morally bankrupt. They have no conscience. Part of this is the juggernaut thing of same-sex marriage and some things like that. God has judged them. He has given them over to a reprobate mind, which our friend Jacob Prasch says, they lose the ability to reason. They think like morons. That's a quote from Jacob. So I happen to agree with that 100%, which is why I said it. But then probably the most alarming spectacle of this was the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. And I apologize. Look, I've not played Barack Obama clips for at least 3-4 weeks. So I'm playing more this week, so bear with it. But you need to listen to what this man said because it's absolutely stunning.
But we also see faith being twisted and distorted, used as a wedge, or worse, sometimes used as a weapon.
Talking about religion.
From a school in Pakistan to the streets of Paris, we have seen violence and terror perpetrated by those who profess to stand up for faith, their faith. profess to stand up for Islam, but in fact are betraying it. We see ISIL, a brutal, vicious death cult that, in the name of religion, carries out unspeakable acts of barbarism, terrorizing religious minorities like the Yazidis, subjecting women to rape as a weapon of war, and claiming the mantle of religious authority for such actions. We see sectarian war in Syria, the murder of Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, religious war in the Central African Republic, a rising tide of anti-Semitism and hate crimes in Europe, so often perpetrated in the name of religion. And so how do we, as people of faith, reconcile these realities? The profound good, the strength, the tenacity, the compassion and love that can flow from all of our faiths, operating alongside those who seek to hijack religious for their own murderous ends. Humanity's been grappling with these questions throughout human history. And lest we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. Michelle and I returned from India, an incredible, beautiful country, full of this magnificent diversity, but a place where in past years religious faiths of all types have, on occasion, been targeted by other peoples of faith simply due to their heritage and their beliefs. Acts of intolerance that would have shocked Gandhiji, the person who helped to liberate that nation.
You notice he used the name Gandhiji and not just Gandhi. Actually, I was researching this and I found out there's an evangelical church whose series this week isn't something like what we're doing here at Fellowship Bible Chapel, a great series that Steve and Mike have done on Hebrews. No, they're doing the gospel according to Gandhi. An evangelical church in the United States of America is doing this nonsense. Do you understand how far this thing has gone down, how far down the road we are, folks? I don't want to be Chicken Little, but because Chicken Little said the sky is falling. The sky has fallen, okay? It's over for these people. These people under God's judgment. Obama had a little bit more to say. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I can't take it anymore.
So this is not unique to one group or one religion. There is a tendency in us, a sinful tendency that can pervert and distort our faith. In today's world, when hate groups have their own Twitter accounts and bigotry can fester in hidden places in cyberspace, it can be even harder to counteract such intolerance. But God compels us to try. And in this mission, I believe there are a few principles that can guide us, particularly those of us who profess to believe. And first, we should start with some basic humility. I believe that the starting point of faith is some doubt. Not being so full of yourself and so confident that you are right and that God speaks only to us and doesn't speak to others. That God only cares about
us and doesn't care about others. That
Okay, I'm going to. What he goes on to say is that, so first, in the first part of what he said is Islam doesn't have anything to do with what ISIS and the Islamic State and the Houthis and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Central African Republic and Boko Haram, and it has nothing to do with anything. Okay, that they're perverting or they're claiming religion, but they're not operating out of religion. But then he turns around and he says, but the Crusades were in the name of Christ. Jim Crow and slavery was in the name of Christ. Every person that's a Christian that heard that lie ought to be outraged at what this lying deceiver said. I'm going to get audited by the IRS this year, I just know it. But it's worse. Even the Pope, he goes on in this little talk of his to say, well, we have the First Amendment, but we shouldn't say things that insult other religions. He just did it. Because no Christian's going to go kill him. But if he said something negative about Islam, they would. And the Pope says the same thing. Mock Islam and expect the punch. I don't know if you want me to play this. I have about a 4-minute clip of Bill Warner that talked about, I'm going to skip over because you've seen it before. Bill Warner is politicalislam.com. Go watch the video clips there. They're superbly well, they're well done, they're well researched. He's got pretty good graphics. And he did this one thing on comparing the battles of Islam, jihad, to the Crusades. And in the area of the Greco-Roman influence, the Mediterranean, in Europe, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, he counted over from the beginning of Islam to 1920, 500, I think it was 580 battles that jihadists fought all over the region. Estimated dead, 300 million people. He then does a little thing on the Crusades. They operated in about a 110-year window, and there were about a dozen battles. There's no comparison, historically, to what he said. This is what happens in the end times when God sends judgment on people, gives them a reprobate mind, and sends a spirit of deception on the world. People are in a fog and they lose the ability to reason, to look at facts. And this is, I show you, every week I show you example after example. And it just so happens that this time it's the guy most people would call the leader of the free world. It's, you don't have, by the way, just so, and people listening, you have no idea up here how much self-censoring I do on a weekly basis, okay? There's a lot of stuff that I really want to say, but I don't. So I just want you to know that. Here's just a little clip of a rabbi. I found Caroline Glick put this up on her Facebook page, and I think this guy has a very good assessment talking about the third commandment, and then this is just the minute or so of his conclusion talking about the third commandment, which is don't take the name of the Lord God in vain. And so he talks about, being children of God, what you're supposed to do, righteousness, justice, and that type of thing, and then the other religion.
And the Bible tells us exactly how to define monotheism. Genesis 18, verse 18 and 19. God says, Abraham will surely be a great nation. I have loved him and chosen him, because he is teaching his children and household after him to observe and take responsibility for the pathway of God, to do acts of compassionate righteousness and moral justice. Compassionate righteousness, loving righteousness, moral justice, in order to enhance life. When you make God Satan and in his name murder innocents, that's not monotheism, that's mono-Satanism. That's not only the end of religion, it's the end of humanity as we know it. Shabbat Shalom.
Powerful statement. Islam is mono-Satanism. Pray for that man. I don't know his name right off the top of my head. Melody Phillips writing in the Jerusalem Post Friday, the Obama doctrine, Israel's enemy is my friend. She talks about the complaints about Netanyahu. She says this, what planet are these people living on? The Obama administration and the left in Israel. The issue, and it could hardly be more urgent or grave, is not Netanyahu's behavior. The issue is how to stop Iran. It is astounding to claim that Netanyahu is putting the relationship with Obama at risk. That is what everyone should be talking about. The wholly artificial storm whipped up by the White House merely illustrates once again Obama's sustained malice towards Israel, the invaluable bulwark of Western defenses in the Middle East, while he empowers Iran and other enemies of America and the free world. Obama's liberal Pollyanna narcissism is thus given a malevolent edge. I really like the way she writes. Is thus given a malevolent edge by his belief that the one impediment to the new world order he wants to create, formed in his resentful mind, she's Jewish by the way, resentful mind by evening up the score between the oppressive U.S. and the oppressed developing world, is the state of Israel. You understand this prophetic significance of that? Pray for Melanie. So for Obama, the enemy is Israel, not Iran. What we're seeing is not just a knockdown fight with Israel. We are watching the destruction of America's role as guarantor and protector of the free world and the translation of the U.S. instead into the facilitator of Islamic terror and war. In fact, I don't have the thing I was going to put up, but a little over a week ago, 15 Muslim leaders came to the White House for a private meeting with Obama. Until a couple days ago, you can get the list, I think, in Friday's editorial page of the Investor Business Daily. They finally released the list of these people who were there. And many of them have been involved in advocacy of Islamic terrorism. They were in the White House with our president, folks. Now, they didn't bring CARE in because that would have been even a little bit too much over the top for Obama, although I'm not sure that there's much left that he can do at this point. Even Egypt is having trouble with Hamas. And of course, we know the president was here, of the king of Jordan, Abdullah, and went back to inspire his people to take on the Islamic State. A Muslim, a committed Muslim doing that. Here's a little bit Hannity talking to Charles Krauthammer about what Obama said at the prayer breakfast.
What was your reaction to the prayer breakfast?
I was stunned that the president could say something so, at once banal and offensive. Here we are not 2 days away from an act of sort of shocking barbarism, the burning alive of a prisoner of war. And Obama's message is that we should remember the Crusades and the Inquisition. For him to say that all of us have sinned, all religions have been transgressed is adolescent stuff. Everyone knows that. What's important is what's happening now. Christianity no longer goes on crusades, and it gave up the Inquisition a while ago. The book of Joshua is knee-deep in blood. That story is over too. The story of today, of our generation, is the fact that the overwhelming volume of the violence and the barbarism that we are seeing in the world, from Nigeria to Paris, all the way to Pakistan and even to the Philippines, the island of Mindanao in the Philippines.
Australia?
Is coming from one source.
Yep.
And that's from inside Islam. It is not the prevalent idea of Islam, but it is coming from Islam, as many Islamic leaders, including the President of Egypt, and many others have admitted, and there needs to be a change in Islam. It is not a coincidence that all of these attacks on other religions are happening all over the world, in a dozen countries, 24 countries, all in the name of one religion. It's not a coincidence. And for the president to be lecturing us and to say we shouldn't get on a high horse and to not remember our own path is ridiculous. The present issue is Muslim radicalism and how to attack it.
I
a
actually
lot of
think
people are dying.
I'm going to just play about 30 seconds of Mark Levin talking about the same thing.
You talk about moral relativism, Mark. The terrible deeds in the name of Christ. He can't even say the Islamic State is ISIS. Would he ever say the terrible deeds committed in the name of Muhammad? Could you ever hear those words coming out of his mouth?
No, we won't. This man is a nihilist and a narcissist and an extremist, and I would like to suggest that, Mr. Obama, here's a suggestion for you as the leader of the United States. This weekend, rather than going off and campaigning or going on vacation, why don't you go across the Potomac River into Arlington National Cemetery? Why don't you walk the rows and rows and rows of the dead heroes who liberated peoples who were facing genocide and tyranny of all kinds, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all kinds of wars. Those young men, if you look at those headstones, the overwhelming majority, all religions, but the overwhelming majority, Mr. Obama, are Christians. Why didn't you speak to them today, Mr. Obama? And ironically, you brought up slavery in the United States. And what's ironic about it, Sean, is if Abraham Lincoln took the position of Barack Obama, it would have been something like this. Lincoln saying, we've had slavery on every continent, in every country, since the beginning of mankind. The Egyptians enslaved the Jews. The Romans enslaved the Christians. Slavery is almost a human natural act, is it not? And Lincoln would say, following Obama's argument, don't get on your high horse. This is not an existential threat, Obama said the other day, of the genocide in the Middle East. And Lincoln might say, why in the world would I send hundreds of thousands of men to their death to end slavery? What Obama is saying and doing is the lowest of the low now. He really is not a leader of a great people. He's not a leader of a great nation. He is stuck in his own ideology. He's stubborn and ignorant at the same time. There are black Christians and black Muslims in Africa who are being slaughtered. They don't want to hear about the Jim Crow laws. There are Christians, there are other Muslims being slaughtered in the Middle East. They don't need a lecture from Obama about Christianity. The fact of the matter is, Obama is not doing anything effective or substantive to stop genocide in our time.
For example, this week, we saw...
Okay. I need about 10 or 15 more minutes. If you can stay, I'd encourage you. I understand if you have to leave, but I want you to hear this because this is important. We've talked a lot here about the Lausanne movement and the concern in the Lausanne movement that Christianity, the gospel, it becomes cast as the whole gospel for the whole world. But what it really becomes is a gospel about social justice, not about sin and repentance and the need for a Savior. They had a meeting in Cape Town a couple of years ago. Recently, at Gordon Conwell Seminary, back in April, a man named Steve Haas went to Gordon Conwell and gave a chapel lecture. I'm going to play parts of that chapel lecture for you. You have to hear this and understand that, by the way, you would probably have guessed this even if you hadn't seen his bio. Do you see where he's a graduate of? Okay, you need to listen to what he has to say. And they came out with a Lausanne publication called All of Me, Lausanne Global Analysis. And this is what they said at the introduction. In this issue, we break with the normal practice to include a rather longer article edited from a talk on the importance of a theology of social engagement, which is so powerful as it stands that we felt that we should not cut it. This is an edited version of a chapel talk given at Gordon Conwell Seminary on April 2nd, 2014. Now, look, I'm going to play just a brief clip of another Fuller graduate, okay? Rob Bell, and a message he gave back in 2007 called Wine in Heaven. Listen to this.
This idea
It's talking
that
about
if you're
the
really
rapture.
connected with God, this life is, okay, it's nice, but you're going somewhere else, and that's really where it's at. And so you really can't be bothered with the blood and guts of life here, because you're so advanced, you're on your way somewhere else. And he says right here, be so careful of a disembodied, meaning a gospel that doesn't also say it's about the physical as well as the spiritual. They're integrated, because humans are integrated
This is a travesty
beings.
that he
It's
would
what was this
say
first?
this is twisting the
heresy.
scripture
Somebody
to say
told
what
me
he wants.
what they call it, and I thought it was
He's talking
brilliant.
about
Next.
Gnosticism.
Let's call it evacuation
He's turning
theology.
people that believe about Gnosticism into people who believe in the rapture, that they're the Gnostics. He's flipped it upside down and twisted it to serve his crazy liberal theological point of view. He goes on to say
meaning my
this.
religion could kill you. Now, this idea that if you're really connected with God, this life is, okay, it's nice, but you're going somewhere else, and that's really where it's at. And so you really can't be bothered with the blood and guts of life here, because you're so advanced, you're on your way somewhere else.
Okay, now look, this is a mischaracterization of people that have an eschatology such as ours. It's a lie. It's just a bald-faced. Can I say that, Steve? I should have cleared this with Pastor Steve. It's a lie. It's not true. Every one of you here care about the blood and guts of the here and now. You're looking forward to being with Jesus, but you got life here to deal with. And family and work and all that stuff. And for this guy to say that you don't care is a lie. There's no other way to say it. He goes on to talk about that one of the great evangelical success stories was Rwanda, and they estimated that 80% of people in Rwanda were saved. And he says, but they believed that when you die, you went to heaven. So when there became a dispute back in the 90s, 800,000 Rwandans killed in 100 days. It happened because they believed if they died, they went to heaven, so they just didn't care. That's why they could go kill other people. Do you understand the slander that's involved in that statement? In the article from the Lausanne Global Analysis, Steve Haas, who, by the way, started off talking about, look, guys, I know that he works for World Vision now. So we've been in the news the last few days before I got here, and I apologize. Because what had they done? They had enacted a policy saying we'll allow people who are open homosexuals to work for World Vision. And there was a firestorm. They had to rescind the policy. They lost a lot of donors, that type of thing. And why was World Vision able to do that? Because their theology is all messed up. They're wrong on Israel. They're wrong on the rapture. They're wrong on everything. But this guy goes to Gordon Conwell, one of the leading evangelical seminaries, and what's he talk about? He talks about Rwanda, the exact same thing that Rob Bell talked about. So the only thing I can imagine is this is discussed in the missions classes at Fuller Seminary. He says here, 20 years ago, well over 100 days, over 800,000 people were slaughtered by their own countrymen in a genocidal frenzy of scene proportions. So he's going to go on to talk about a few things. I want to play some of the clips here. I think this is a clip. At the turn of the 20th century, a chasm opened between personal faith and the expression of that faith to the world. The deeds of our belief became de-linked from our words and faith commitments, and the result was an incomplete witness to the world. We are still dealing with the unintended consequences of that one-sided gospel. They came up with some things at Lausanne. One of these things was called container church. The church becomes the container where converts are stored until they get there to heaven. The glorious nature and purpose of the church in itself and God's plans gets little attention. This is what motivates the Lausanne movement. They also categorized a problem as a harvest church, which is get the maximum number of sheaves into the barn before the harvest. Haste is of the essence, and the Great Commission is an unfinished task to which we can bring closure if we only work harder and faster to achieve it. And then there's the lifeboat church. Save souls from a sinking world heading for imminent obliteration. He probably would throw me in this category, I hope. The church becomes a lifeboat, and there is no rationale, motivation, or time for engagement with the world itself, culturally, socially, or ecologically. This is what Lausanne thinks of people like us. And the fact that so many evangelical churches are buying into this, people, should be very troubling. Well, here's some clips from that lecture at the seminary. Well, I guess I don't have that clip. Well, he says this: the litany of attempts to protect God and our theology is not branded made in the USA or confined to our country's timeline or borders. Now listen to this particular statement. It was ill-conceived theology that launched the ships of the Spanish Inquisition or the legions of religious purifiers known as the Crusades. Evangelism by the sword makes it hard to have conversations with Muslims or other unbelievers aware of this history. Even in the last century, amidst the horrors of apartheid in South Africa, many who voted to restrict the rights of the blacks were pillars in their church communities. As apartheid came to an end in South... Now listen, can I ask you a question? What he just said about the Crusades and Inquisition, was there any difference between what Steve Haas said at Gordon Conwell Chapel in April and what Barack Obama said in Washington, D.C. at the National Prayer Breakfast? There was not a single bit of difference. They all come out of the same bankrupt theology and eschatology. What this should tell us, and I'm going to finish up with just a few more clips, but what this should tell us is, folks, the enemy is in the evangelical church. It's embedded, and you need to be on guard against it. If ever people needed to watch out for the wolves with false theology and doctrine and bad eschatology and that sort of thing, it is now. Those words ring truer now than when Paul spoke them to the elders at Ephesus. Ravenous wolves. As apartheid came to an end in South Africa, one of our World Vision operatives involved with the struggle for freedom asked Bishop Desmond Tutu what more could he do. Tutu replied that he should go to Palestine. What I would have said is, Bishop Tutu, there's no such country. But I guess that's lost on Gordon Conwell. We took the bishop's advice, and World Vision has been active in Palestine for the better part of 30 years, growing to become one of the largest organizations there. Yet for over 60 years, many evangelicals have clung to a very narrow theological narrative that weds Christian theology with a political ideology known as Zionism.
Simply put, is a national movement to return Jews to Israel, simply put, what Jews perceive as their sovereign homeland. And as many of you know, recently your own Dr. Hollinger actually went with a group of senior theological statesmen, presidents of 4 other seminaries, to actually view the land, to listen to the dialogue, to hear what churches are saying, what leaders are saying on both sides of the wall. And the truth is that in my tribe, we've used this theology in affirming biblical Israel to be the same as the present political entity bearing the same name, with all the rights, privileges, and promises directly conferred. They're called Christian Zionists. And they've drawn parallels from what we've seen in numerous military victories and the massive social work that's taken place, and tied them to specific Bible verses, all serving to affirm the full circle of prophetic expression. If allowed to speak, they would say that the strength of the nation of present-day Israel in some way underlines the strength of our own Christian faith, as though it was an extension, a direct link.
Now, you notice that they changed the article to false, when in fact what he said was the full circle of prophetic expression. What he said was the false circle of prophetic expression. In other words, what people are saying about Israel and Zionism is false. It's not. He continues.
I know this because for years, mildly, this was my feeling. This was my sense. This is the way I read it. So tied have we become to these formations that our theological interpretations, our eschatological charts, our predictions, we've actually labeled any critical comment against the nation state as antithetical to Christian belief. Basically, anti-Jewish. I can just see you wanting to get out and tweet, Steve Hawes, hashtag anti-Semite. You know, you just want to. You'd miss the point, though. Because I love the Jewish people. Here's the rub. I love Palestinians, too. Unintended consequences pressed by our theological assurances. Predominantly, my tribe has backed the world's largest and longest occupation of another people group in modern history. We become party to an oppressive Israel legal system that Tutu and many other church leaders have said is apartheid on steroids.
Now look, I've said tongue-in-cheek that I have not always agreed with Israel. I thought they should have attacked Iran before. So there are times I disagree with the leadership in Israel. This Iran thing is coming to the fore. I'm trying to decide what happened in 1937 and 38 is repeating itself with Kerry and Obama in Iran. It's the exact same thing. And because of the deception that God's sending out, they cannot see it. Reports began surfacing last week that the Obama administration is offering Iran technical concessions on its nuclear infrastructure in exchange for Iran's use of its leverage to tamper regional turmoil. Benjamin Netanyahu last week on CBS Face the Nation said, folks, Iran is not your ally. Very simple, very clear, very direct. That's why Obama hates him. In Lausanne 2010, you need to understand that this belief about people who believe in end times eschatology, such as we teach here, there was a paper presented by Oz Guinness and David Wells, I referred to it before, called Global Gospel, Global Era, Christian Discipleship and Mission in the Age of Globalization. And that article that they wrote that all the people at Lausanne got, it's on the website, you can still find it. Needless to say, they say, globalization poses a sharp challenge to both accuracy and humility, and we need to start by avoiding the two equal and opposite pitfalls into which so many fall. The excessive wow attitudes of the cheerleaders and the excessive gloom and doom of the curmudgeons who in their Christian form view globalization as the precursor to the end times. Well, I am a curmudgeon, an ill-tempered person full of resentment and stubborn notions. Okay. The point of all of it is this, is that this view about Israel, and he goes on in his talk to support Lausanne involvement in this conference called Christ at the Checkpoint. this is how they twist it and turn it against Israel. That Israel's the cause of the Palestinian Christians' problems. This is what a Palestinian minister said. Hana Masad spoke about Rami Ayad, a believer executed by Gaza militants, just one of many Arab Christians targeted for their faith. Christians in the West are supporting an occupation seen as evil and unjust. Some extremists react against that by taking out hostility on innocent Arab Christians, said Joseph Cumming of Yale University. You have to go to Yale University to say something that ridiculous. He's the same guy, he's the same as Barack Obama. That these extremists, the extremists are reacting against something else. It's not where they're really coming from. Ramirez's cartoon this week says, if we were aware of the evil back then, would the world have prevented it? And the answer is no. Victor Davis Hanson has a great article. I'll maybe read this next week because I want to get you out of here. Narcissistic appeasement, the road most reckless. And what he does is he compares Obama to Neville Chamberlain, who he said was a narcissist, well known as a narcissist, and lo and behold, Barack Obama is the same thing, and his narcissism trumps every other ability that he has to reason and see exactly what's going on. And this is a very difficult, troubling time for the world. So I hope I made my point. What you see, though, is you see this growing thing through the Lausanne movement and emergent church and social justice that plays right into what Obama says. When the man of sin appears on the scene, there will be plenty of support for that man within what we know today as the evangelical church. That's why we need to warn people. You're a watchman, you see it happening, you tell people. That's what we try to do here. If we saw it happening and we didn't say anything, then the blood of those people is on us. But if we warn them, then we've absolved ourselves of responsibility for what they choose to do with that information. So it is a time of great deception that is coming. And the church, what we know as the evangelical church, needs to wake up, needs to repent, stop all this nonsense, and get back into the Word, and repent and preach the gospel. So that's it for this week. Thanks for staying. I appreciate it. Let's pray. Father, guard our hearts, guard our minds. Give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and minds to understand the things that are coming upon the world and will continue to come upon the world until the return of your Son in glory. Lord, keep us pure, faithful until that day. Give us courage, wisdom, and opportunity to share the truths about what's coming and the solution, which is faith in Jesus Christ. Repentance of our sin and faith in Jesus Christ is our only hope and the only hope for the people in this world. Bless us as we go this week in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.